so for these questions that ask about the domain and range of a parabola, the first thing to realize is that parabolas are polynomials. And because they're polynomials, they always have this ax squared plus bx plus c form, or a times x minus the x vertex squared plus the y vertex. There's no denominator, there's no radical, and so that means that the domain is always going to be negative infinity to infinity. So that is always true, that when we're talking about a parabola, it will be negative infinity to infinity because, again, there's no denominator and there's no radical. Now, the range you could have some variation on, but it will always involve the y vertex as either the smallest or largest point, and then one of the infinities. So if the parabola opens up, then the y vertex is obviously the smallest point, and your range will go from the y vertex to infinity. And if your parabola opens down, then in that case, the lowest point is negative infinity up to the y vertex. So on these questions 9 through 12, where they ask for the domain range, what I like to do is just kind of draw myself a little picture of what's happening. So this tells us that the parabola opens up, and so the lowest point will happen at that vertex of 1, negative 5. Now, again, the domain, you don't even have to blink an eye. That is always going to be negative infinity to infinity because there's no denominator, there's no square root. The range, you know that it's going to involve either a y vertex and then a plus or a minus infinity. So in this case, our y vertex is the smallest value because our parabola opens up. So our range will start at negative 5. We'll put a square bracket because we want to include that number, and then it will go to infinity. And keep in mind, we want to include this because we have a filled-in circle there. Now, if you have a question like number 11, where they tell you that there's a max, in order for there to be a max point, your parabola is going to have to open down. So this whole thing about that there's a max tells us that the parabola opens down, and then they tell us that it's at x is equal to negative 1. So that tells us that this highest point has an x coordinate of negative 1, and then the max is always going to be equal to a y value. So it's equal to negative 8 tells us that the y value is negative 8. So coming up with the domain, again, the domain is always negative infinity to infinity. And then for our range, because we have a highest point, the highest point here of negative 8 is going to be the end of our range. So we'll have negative 8 in a square bracket, and then the lowest point, because this parabola goes down forever, will be negative infinity. So here our range will go from negative infinity to negative 8.